to new beginnings and honest choices.
You're really gonna let this happen?
If you're done here, then leave this house.
Be careful calling it your house.
This is still my house.
No, Mrs. Calloway. I'm your new landlord.
At Thanksgiving dinner, 5 months pregnant Clara watched her husband's entire family raise a glass to his mistress, but no one expected the man walking through the door to turn the whole night upside down. Stay to the end to see whether a betrayed wife chooses revenge, forgiveness, or something far more powerful, her own dignity. Clara knew before she walked through the door. She had known for 3 weeks, actually. 3 weeks since she found the hotel receipt Graham forgot to delete from his email. 3 weeks since she sat in her car in a parking garage for 40 minutes, not crying, just thinking, running numbers in her head the way she always did when something needed to be solved. She was 5 months pregnant. She had no interest in being reckless. So she came to Thanksgiving dinner. The Calloway townhouse on the Upper West Side was the kind of place that announced itself before you even rang the bell. 4 floors, original crown molding, a chandelier visible through the second-floor window from the street. Graham's parents had lived here for nearly 2 decades, and they had never once let anyone forget it. Clara rang the bell. A housekeeper opened the door and took her coat. Clara smoothed her dress over her stomach and walked into the foyer. She could hear voices in the dining room. She could smell roasted turkey and something sweet, maybe cranberries. She could already hear Dorothy laughing at something, that particular laugh she reserved for people she was performing for. Clara followed the sound. The dining room was full. Edwin at the head of the table, Dorothy near the center, Graham's aunts, a cousin or two, a family friend whose name Clara could never remember, and there, seated directly beside Graham, wearing a cream blouse and pearl earrings, was Camille Sutton, communications consultant, hired by Calloway Hospitality 14 months ago, now seated at a Thanksgiving table like she had always had a chair there. Graham looked up when Clara walked in. His expression shifted. Not guilt exactly. More like someone who had been hoping traffic would make a specific person late. Clara, he stood. You look good, thank you. She sat down, across from Camille. She placed her hands in her lap and she looked at the centerpiece, which was an arrangement of white roses and dried eucalyptus that Dorothy had probably spent $200 on. Nobody introduced Camille. That told Clara everything. If it had been nothing, someone would have introduced her. You remember Camille from the firm. Normal words, normal dinner. But nobody said anything, which meant everyone at the table already knew what Camille was, and nobody had called Clara to warn her, and Dorothy had set the table this way on purpose. Clara picked up her water glass and took a sip. Dorothy spent the first hour of dinner talking directly around Clara. She asked Graham about the hotel expansion project. She asked Edwin about his golf schedule. She asked Camille, twice, what she thought about a communications challenge Calloway Hospitality had faced last quarter. Camille really understands the pressure you're under, Graham, Dorothy said at one point, refilling her own wine glass. She gets the business in a way that takes most people years to develop. Camille smiled modestly. I've just had wonderful access. Graham stared at his plate. Clara passed the breadbasket to his aunt. She was not going to cry. She was not going to raise her voice. She had decided in the car on the way over that whatever happened tonight, she was going to stay composed because she had a daughter growing inside her body, and she refused to let this dinner be the first turbulent thing that child ever heard. The turkey was good, actually. Clara ate most of what was on her plate. After dinner, Edwin rose from his chair. He was a tall man, Edwin Calloway, silver-haired, the kind of man who had never spent a day of his adult life uncertain about whether he belonged in a room. He picked up his wine glass and waited for the table to settle. I want to say a few words, Edwin said. Clara looked up. This family has been through some difficult changes recently. He paused. He looked around the table with the measured calm of someone who had rehearsed this. But I believe in honesty, and I believe in the courage it takes to face a hard truth instead of running from it. He lifted his glass a little higher. To people brave enough to choose happiness when a marriage has already failed. Nobody moved for 1 full second. Then Dorothy raised her glass. Then Camille raised hers. Then the cousin, then the aunt. Then the family friend whose name Clara couldn't remember. Clara sat with one hand resting gently over her stomach. She did not raise her glass. She did not say a word. She just sat there, 5 months pregnant, at a table where her father-in-law had just toasted her replacement, and she breathed slowly and she kept her hand right where it was. Graham leaned toward her. His voice was low and urgent and slightly desperate. Clara, please. Don't make this worse. She turned and looked at him, really looked at him, at the way he was still sitting there, at the way he had not told Camille to leave when she arrived, at the way he had not stood up 30 seconds ago when his father made that toast. "I'm not the person making this worse," she said it quietly. She did not need volume. The words were enough, and that was the moment. Not the toast, not the seating arrangement, not even the hotel receipt 3 weeks ago. That exact moment, his whisper in her answer, was the moment Clara Bellamy Calloway ended her marriage. Not dramatically, not loudly, just finally, the dessert came out. Pumpkin pie and a pecan tart. Clara took a small slice of the pecan tart because she actually liked pecan tart, and she saw no reason to stop eating food she liked, just because her marriage was over. She was almost done when Dorothy appeared at her shoulder. "Clara." Dorothy's voice was silk over something hard. "Could we speak privately for a moment?" They stepped into the hallway off the kitchen. It was quieter there. Just the two of them under a wall sconce and a framed painting of the Hudson River that Dorothy had bought at an auction in 2018. "I want to speak plainly," Dorothy said. "Go ahead. If you intend to divorce Graham, then you should also prepare to leave this house." She said it without blinking, like she was explaining a commute schedule. That's the practical reality. "I think it's better you hear it now than later." Clara looked at her mother-in-law, at the earrings she always wore, at the careful positioning of her shoulders, at the way Dorothy Calloway had spent 11 years treating Clara like a visitor in a home she had helped maintain. "You really should stop calling it that." Dorothy blinked. "Excuse me? Calling it this house, like it belongs to you." Before Dorothy could answer, the doorbell rang. Clara walked back to the foyer. The housekeeper was already opening the door, and standing on the front steps wearing a dark coat and carrying nothing except his car keys was Warren Bellamy. He was 39, 6 feet. He had their father's jaw and their mother's eyes, and a quiet authority that he had never once felt the need to announce out loud. Clara had invited him 4 weeks ago when Thanksgiving was still supposed to be a normal holiday. She had not uninvited him when it stopped being normal. She had not warned him about what he would be walking into. She had just trusted that he would figure it out. He looked past the housekeeper and found Clara standing in the foyer. He looked at her face. Then he looked at the dining room behind her, where the family was still seated, where the wine glasses were still out, where Camille Sutton was visible, still beside Graham. Warren walked inside. "Warren." Dorothy's voice came from behind Clara, sharp and immediate. "This is a family matter." Warren didn't answer her right away. He looked around the room slowly. He saw the chairs. He saw the arrangement. He saw his younger sister, 5 months pregnant, standing apart from everyone else, like she had been separated from the group on purpose. He understood enough. Dorothy stepped forward. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," she said it with the full weight of the Calloway townhouse behind her. 4 floors of original crown molding, a chandelier, 19 years of social authority. Warren reached into his coat pocket and he set a business card on the entryway table. Clean. Simple. He didn't make a show of it. "I don't think that's your decision anymore." Edwin came into the foyer. "What is that supposed to mean?" The dining room had gone quiet. Clara could hear the cousin's chair scrape back. The aunt appeared in the doorway. Camille stayed seated, but her head was turned watching. Warren looked at Edwin, then at Dorothy, then at the room. "My firm acquired the company that owns this property on Wednesday." Silence. Not the polite kind. The kind where everybody in the room suddenly needs a moment to understand what just changed. Warren looked directly at Dorothy. "Technically, Mrs. Calloway, I'm your new landlord." Nobody spoke. Dorothy's hand was at her collarbone. Edwin's face had gone the particular color that comes right before anger finds its footing. Camille, from the dining room, had stopped pretending to look elsewhere. Graham stood completely still. Clara stood beside her brother, and for the first time all evening, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The room broke apart slowly, the way rooms do when something real has been said, and nobody knows yet how to respond to real things. Edwin was the first to recover. He straightened his jacket and he looked at Warren with the careful expression of a man deciding whether this was a threat or a mistake. "You're going to want to be very careful," Edwin said. "I'm always careful." Warren's voice was even. "That's how acquisitions work. This is a family home. It's a leased property." Warren glanced around the foyer with the mild professional focus of someone taking inventory. "A very nice one. The lease is valid and we intend to honor it. I just wanted to be clear about who you'll be dealing with going forward." Dorothy had recovered from the first shock and was moving into the second phase, which with Dorothy was always performed indignation. "You walked into this house on Thanksgiving and told us you've bought the building. You think that's appropriate?" "I was invited," Warren said simply. He looked at Clara. "By my sister." Clara said nothing. She didn't need to. Graham finally spoke Clara. He was looking at her with an expression she had learned to read over 11 years together. It was the expression that meant he needed her to manage something so that he didn't have to. "Can we talk about this somewhere else?" There's nothing to talk about tonight. Clara, I came to Thanksgiving dinner, she said. I sat at your table. I ate the food. I watched your father make a toast. She kept her voice calm, completely calm. I think that's enough for one evening. Graham looked at the floor. Camille appeared in the doorway of the dining room. She was holding her wine glass, and she was wearing the expression of someone trying to look sympathetic while also watching closely to see how the situation was going to resolve. She looked at Warren. Then she looked at Clara. Then she set her wine glass down on the sideboard, very carefully, and she said nothing. Smart enough, at least, to understand that this was not her moment to speak. The cousin slipped out through the kitchen. The aunt made a quiet excuse about needing to help with the dishes. The family friend, whose name Clara couldn't remember, had already disappeared. The dinner was over. Dorothy stood by the staircase with her arms crossed and her chin lifted, watching Warren the way she watched contractors, who had quoted her prices she found unreasonable. Edwin was on his phone in the study. Clara could hear his voice through the partially closed door, low and urgent. His attorney? Probably. Warren waited in the foyer without any particular hurry. He had the patience of someone who had spent 20 years in rooms where other people were more agitated than he was. Clara got her coat from the housekeeper. She buttoned it slowly. She picked up her bag. She stood in the foyer of the Calloway townhouse for what she already knew, standing there, would be one of the last times. She thought about the first time Graham had brought her here, a Sunday lunch early in their relationship. How Dorothy had shown her the dining room with such careful pride. How Clara had admired the molding genuinely because she did love architecture. How she had thought, back then, that this was going to be her family. She had tried very hard to make that true. Warren held the front door open. Clara walked through it. The November air was cold and clean and smelled like the city after a long day. The street was quiet. A cab moved past at the end of the block. She stood on the top step and she breathed. Warren stood beside her. He didn't put his arm around her. He didn't ask if she was okay. He just stood there, next to her, in the cold, which was exactly what she needed. After a moment, Clara said, I found out 3 weeks ago. I know. She glanced at him. You knew? You sent me that property recommendation 8 months ago, and then you stopped mentioning Thanksgiving until last month when you suddenly wanted me there. He shrugged. I'm your brother. I pay attention. Clara looked back at the street. I'm not ready to say any of this out loud yet, she said. Not the whole thing. You don't have to. I need to find an apartment, something I pay for myself. Okay, and I need you to not make decisions for me. He was quiet for a second. Also okay. I mean it, Warren. I know you do. A light went on in one of the upper floors of the townhouse. Through the curtain, Clara could see the shape of someone moving. She couldn't tell if it was Graham or his mother. She found, standing on the step, that she didn't particularly need to know. She pulled her coat tighter. Let's go, she said. They walked down the steps together, side by side, into the cold November dark. And that was how Clara Bellamy Calloway left the house that was never hers to begin with. The Calloways did not sleep well that night. Clara knew this the way you know things about people you've lived alongside for years. Not because anyone told her. Just because she understood how that family operated. And she knew that the moment she and Warren walked down those front steps, Edwin was on the phone with his attorney, and Dorothy was already rewriting the evening into a version where she was the injured party. Clara, on the other hand, slept fine. Not deeply, but fine. She lay in the guest room of a hotel 2 miles away, her hand resting on her stomach, and she let herself feel the full weight of the day settle without trying to push it anywhere. Some nights that's all you can do. Just let the thing be what it is. By morning, Warren had already received 2 calls from Edwin's lawyer and 1 voicemail from Dorothy herself. He played the voicemail for Clara over coffee in the hotel lobby. Dorothy's voice was measured and tight. Every word chosen the way you choose words when you're recording something you expect to be transcribed. Clara listened. Then she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked out the window at the street. What do you want to do? Warren asked. I want to eat breakfast first. So they did. Afterward, they sat across from each other at a small table by the window, and Warren told her plainly what the legal situation was. He'd already spoken to his property counsel that morning. The answer was not complicated. They have a valid lease, Warren said. Ownership changed hands. That doesn't change their rights as tenants. Clara nodded slowly. So they can stay. They can stay until the lease expires, and any violations have to go through proper notice procedures. Cure periods, the whole process. He set his coffee down. I'm not going to throw them onto the street, Clara. That's not how this works, and it's not what I'm going to do. She looked at him. Even after last night, he said it without any hesitation. Being wronged doesn't give us the right to abuse what we have. That's not a legal point. That's just true. Clara was quiet for a moment. She had known that was what he would say. That was partly why she trusted him. There is a particular kind of person who, when they suddenly find themselves holding power over someone who hurt them, uses that power cleanly. Warren was that person. He had been that person her entire life. It was one of the most important things she had ever learned from watching him. Power used badly turns the person holding it into something they didn't mean to become. She didn't want that. Not for him. Not for herself. Okay, she said. There are violations we can document. Maintenance reimbursements they've delayed. Some interior modifications that weren't approved. Use of the property for corporate events that may not align with residential lease terms. He ticked through the list without relish. We'll send a formal notice. Standard cure period. Everything through proper channels. And the lease renewal? Warren picked up his coffee again. That's a decision for later. 8 months from now. Clara nodded. That was enough for right now. She spent the rest of the morning making calls. Her own attorney, her bank, 2 property management contacts she had kept in her personal files from her years in real estate acquisitions. By noon, she had a list of 3 apartments to see that afternoon, all in buildings she had vetted herself, all within a price range she could manage independently. She called no one in the Calloway family. She was not angry when she made these calls. She was just organized, moving through a checklist the way she always did when something needed to be solved. Clara had always been better in motion than in stillness. Grief for her came later. First came the list. She looked at 2 apartments that afternoon and put a deposit on the second one. 3rd floor, 2 bedrooms. Good light in the room she was already mentally converting to a nursery. The kitchen was smaller than she would have liked, but the building was quiet, and the lease was straightforward, and it was hers. Not Graham's, not the Calloway's, hers.
Warren offered to cover the deposit. I have money, Clara said. I know you do. I'm just...
Warren, he stopped. I know you want to help, she said, and I love you for it. But I'm not replacing one arrangement with another. She looked at him directly. Being pregnant means I need people who care about me. It doesn't mean I need people making my decisions for me. He opened his mouth. She wasn't done. You're my brother. Stand beside me. Don't stand in front of me. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he gave a small nod. Okay, she repeated. She paid the deposit herself. Graham came home from a breakfast meeting the morning after Thanksgiving to find Clara in their bedroom, moving through the closet with the quiet efficiency of someone who had already decided what they were doing. She was packing. Not frantically. Not dramatically. She was folding things neatly and placing them in a suitcase that she had pulled from the top shelf, and she was working in the particular silence of a person who has already had all the conversations they needed to have inside their own head. Graham stood in the doorway. Clara, she didn't stop. She took a stack of folded sweaters and placed them in the bag. Clara, stop, please. She stopped. She turned and looked at him. He crossed the room. He looked exhausted. He had the face of a man who had been awake since 3 in the morning constructing an argument that he was now not sure would hold. It was a mistake, he said. Camille, all of it. It was a mistake, and I am telling you that right now. Clara looked at him. Which part was the mistake? He blinked. Sleeping with her? She said it without raising her voice. Letting your mother invite her to Thanksgiving? Or asking your pregnant wife not to embarrass you while your family toasted the woman you cheated with? Graham had no answer. She could see him searching for one. She had watched him do this their entire marriage. Reach for the right words in moments when there were no right words. Find some arrangement of language that could smooth the surface over without addressing what was underneath it. There were no words for this. I'll end it completely, he said. I'll cut her out of the company. Out of everything. She's already gone professionally, I'll make sure. Graham. He stopped. My problem isn't that she stayed, Clara said. My problem is that you let me stand alone. She said it clearly, simply. Then she turned back to the suitcase. Graham sat down on the edge of the bed. He sat there while she finished packing that bag and started on the second one. He sat there and he watched her, and he didn't try to stop her again because somewhere in what she had just said he had understood something he couldn't argue with. You can cut a person out of your life. You can end a professional relationship. You can delete phone numbers and return gifts and tell yourself it's over. But you cannot undo the moment your pregnant wife sat alone at a Thanksgiving table while your entire family raised a glass to your affair. You cannot unchoose the silence that said more than anything Edwin put into words. Clara didn't take everything. She took what was hers, what she'd brought into the marriage or bought herself or cared about specifically. She left the things that were his or theirs in the way that meant they belonged to the apartment. She was done in 2 hours. She called a car from the lobby. Graham came downstairs when he heard her wheels on the hardwood. He stood at the bottom of the staircase and he looked at her standing by the front door with 2 bags and her coat on and her whole posture saying what she didn't need to say again. Where are you going? My apartment. You don't have an apartment. I do as of this afternoon. He stared at her. You're not staying with Warren? No. Something moved across his face. Maybe it was the realization that she had done this herself, that she hadn't needed saving, that she had been 3 steps ahead of this moment for longer than he knew. Clara, I'll be in touch through my attorney, she said. About the pregnancy, about everything else. We'll handle it properly. She opened the door. She left. Camille understood, by the day after Thanksgiving, that the landlord reveal had changed things. She had gone into that dinner with a plan. It was a good plan. She had spent months building it quietly, build the professional relationship, make herself indispensable. Let Dorothy do the social work of positioning her as the more suitable option. Let Graham's guilt and conflict eventually push him toward the path of least resistance. She had done all of it correctly. And then Warren Bellamy had put a business card on an entryway table, and the entire structure shifted. Because here was the problem. The story as it currently existed in the rooms that mattered was not favorable to Camille, a communication consultant who became involved with a married client, a family that welcomed her while his pregnant wife sat at the same table, an older brother who turned out to own the building. That story, told plainly, made her look like exactly what she was. Camille was not going to let that story be told plainly. She was good at her work. She had been good at her work for 15 years. She knew how information traveled, how a narrative built its own momentum, how the first version of a story to reach enough people became the version that stuck even when better information came later. She needed to move first. She sat at her desk the Sunday night after Thanksgiving, and she opened her corporate laptop. She had access to files she'd worked on during the Calloway hospitality account, property details, internal communications, some financial documentation related to the townhouse acquisition chain that she had come across during a brand advisory project 6 months ago. She forwarded several files to her personal email. Then she opened a contact on her phone, a gossip columnist she had worked with twice before, feeding information about clients in ways that served her professionally. The columnist was good. She had reach. She could get something circulating by morning. Camille drafted the details carefully. She made herself the peripheral figure. She centered Clara. She framed the story around Warren's acquisition, around the timing, around the suggestion that a wronged wife had used her wealthy brother's resources to seize her husband's family home in the middle of a personal crisis. Pregnant heiress uses wealthy brother to seize husband's family home after marriage collapses. She read it back twice. Then she sent it. She closed her laptop. She believed that by Monday morning the story would be out there. She believed that public pressure would turn Clara Bellamy into the villain of this situation. She believed that if enough people saw Clara as a vindictive rich woman weaponizing her family's money, the sympathy would shift. Graham's family would look like victims. Graham might even look like a man caught in the middle of 2 powerful forces. And she, Camille, would become the woman unfairly caught in someone else's war. It was a good plan. What she did not think about, sitting at that desk on Sunday night, was the corporate laptop. She did not think about IT logs. She did not think about the fact that every file she forwarded, every draft she opened, every attachment she sent to her personal account was recorded on a server that did not belong to her. She did not think about what it would mean. Later, when someone started asking questions about where a particular gossip columnist had gotten her information, Camille was thinking about the stories she was sending out into the world. She was not thinking about the evidence she was leaving behind. Clara saw the story on Monday morning. She was in her new apartment, sitting on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet, eating a bowl of cereal and scrolling through her phone. She saw it first on a social media aggregator, then found the original column 2 taps later. She read the whole thing. Then she put her phone face down on the floor beside her cereal bowl, and she sat there for a minute. It was a specific unpleasant feeling, not shock. She had worked in business long enough to know that when people feel cornered, they do things like this. But knowing something is possible and then reading your name in a story that calls you vindictive while you're sitting on the floor of an empty apartment 5 months pregnant are 2 different experiences. She picked her phone back up. She called her attorney. I saw it. Her attorney said before Clara could speak, "Don't respond publicly. Don't post anything. Don't call anyone at Calloway Hospitality. Let me work." "Okay, I mean it, Clara." "Nothing. I heard you." She put the phone down again. She finished her cereal. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did, moving, making noise, not pausing for any one person's particular bad morning. Clara got up, washed her bowl, and started unpacking boxes. She was not going to spend her energy on Camille's story. She was going to spend it on her daughter's room. She opened the box labeled nursery and pulled out the first small folded blanket, and she held it for a moment. Yellow. She had bought it 2 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon when she still thought her marriage was going to be something she could repair. She folded it again and set it on the windowsill. Then she kept unpacking. The furniture arrived at noon. By evening, the apartment was livable. Warren stopped by around 7 with dinner from a place he knew she liked. He did not try to make decisions. He set the food on her new kitchen counter, sat down when she told him to sit, and ate dinner with her on 2 folding chairs while her actual chairs were still being assembled. He told her the formal lease notice would go out to the Calloways by end of week. She nodded. He told her the violations were well documented. She nodded again. The story, he said carefully. I know. My attorney is handling it. She looked at him. You handle the lease. I'll handle the rest. He considered this. And Graham? Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the expression on Graham's face that morning in the bedroom. The way he had said the word mistake like it could cover everything. Graham has to figure out who he is, she said finally. That's not something I can do for him. Warren nodded. They finished dinner. He left when she told him she was tired. He didn't push. He walked to the door, picked up his coat, and then turned back. You're doing okay, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm doing what needs doing, Clara said. He nodded once more. Then he left. Clara locked the door behind him. She stood in her apartment, and looked at the small folded blanket still sitting on the windowsill. The city light came through at an angle and caught the yellow fabric and made it look warmer than the room actually was. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Tomorrow had its own list. The formal notice arrived at the Calloway townhouse on a Wednesday morning. It came by certified mail, which Edwin signed for himself because the housekeeper had the day off. He stood in the foyer in his robe and read the return address twice before opening it. Bellamy Urban Holdings, the name was printed cleanly on the envelope. No drama, no extra weight to it. Just a name and an address, and the quiet authority of something official. He opened it at the kitchen table. Dorothy came downstairs 20 minutes later and found him still sitting there, the letter in front of him, his coffee going cold beside it. What is it? He slid it toward her without answering. She read it standing up. Her expression didn't break, but Clara would have recognized the particular stillness that came over Dorothy's face when she was processing something she hadn't prepared for. That stillness cost her a lot of effort. Most people couldn't see it. Clara had learned to spot it years ago. The notice was formal and precise and entirely without malice. That was almost the strangest part. It identified several existing issues with the lease. Delayed maintenance reimbursements going back 14 months. Interior modifications made without documented approval from the property owner. Evidence of the townhouse being used for corporate receptions and client entertainment, which raised questions about the residential use terms. Documentation that needed to be corrected or addressed within the contractual cure period. It did not threaten eviction. It did not say a single word about Thanksgiving, about Clara, about any of it. It was just a property management notice, the kind that gets sent when a new owner conducts a proper review of an acquired asset and finds things that weren't being properly tracked by the previous management company. The lease had 8 months remaining. The notice stated clearly that the new ownership would make a renewal decision at the appropriate time. Edwin read it a second time after Dorothy put it down. 8 months, he said. Dorothy poured herself a cup of coffee. Edwin, this house. He pressed 2 fingers to his mouth for a moment. Dorothy, we have run events here. We've had boards of directors through that dining room. I hosted the Meridian closing dinner in the garden 3 summers ago.
I know. That's not residential use. I know that. Our attorney is going to say we have exposure on at least 2 of these points.
Dorothy sat down across from him. She looked at the letter, then at her husband, then at the window that faced the garden. The garden that was technically now being reviewed by someone else's property management firm. Call Graham, she said finally. Edwin reached for his phone. The story Camille had planted didn't explode the way a bomb does. It spread the way a slow leak does. Quietly at first, then faster than anyone expected. Then suddenly it was everywhere, and people were talking about it in terms that had already hardened into fact. By Thursday, Clara's name was attached to words like calculated and vindictive on several high-traffic social media accounts. The gossip column had framed it perfectly for maximum outrage. Wealthy family, collapsed marriage, pregnant wife, rich brother, property seized. It was the kind of story people shared before they finished reading it. Clara's attorney was monitoring it. Warren's communications team was monitoring it. Clara herself checked it twice a day and then put her phone in a drawer because she had decided that watching a false story circulate in real time was not a productive use of her energy. What she had not expected was Graham. She saw it on Friday afternoon. A short statement, posted to his professional social media, brief enough that she almost scrolled past it. He had used his full name, Graham Elliott Calloway. He had not run it through Calloway Hospitality's communications department. He had not cleared it with his parents or their attorneys. He had just posted it. The statement said that the collapse of his marriage was the result of choices he made, that his wife bore no responsibility for those choices, that no one should interpret his family's current situation as something Clara had caused or engineered, that she deserved better than the narrative currently circulating about her. He did not name Camille. He did not get into details. He just said, plainly and publicly, that it was his fault. Clara read it twice. She sat with it for a while. She understood what it had probably cost him to post it without anyone's approval, understood that Dorothy had most likely called him the moment she saw it, understood that Edwin probably considered it an act of spectacular self-destruction. She called him that evening. He picked up on the second ring. "I saw what you posted," she said. "I know." A pause. "Was that okay?" She thought about the question. "You found your voice after I stopped needing it." Silence on his end. Not the silence of someone who didn't understand. The silence of someone who understood completely and had no defense against it. She hadn't said it to wound him. She had said it because it was true, and Clara had made a decision somewhere between Thanksgiving and her new apartment that she was done cushioning true things for the comfort of the person who needed to hear them. "Clara, I appreciate that you did it," she said. "I mean that." She hung up. Graham went to Warren's office on a Tuesday. He hadn't made an appointment. He told the receptionist his name and asked if Warren had 20 minutes, and Warren, who was apparently either curious or generous or both, agreed to see him. The office was on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown. Clean lines, good furniture, nothing showy. Warren was standing when Graham came in, which meant he hadn't decided yet whether this was going to be a sit-down conversation or not. Graham sat anyway. "I need to understand something," Graham said. Warren waited. "The acquisition." Graham kept his voice level. Professional. He was trying to approach this the way he would approach any business conversation. "I need to understand whether this was targeted, whether someone directed this at my family specifically." Warren looked at him for a long moment. "Ask your wife," he said. Graham went still. "What does Clara have to do with the purchase?" Warren said nothing. He didn't look away. He didn't fill the silence with anything. He just sat there and let Graham understand that the answer existed and that it was not Warren's to give. Graham left the office. He drove back to the townhouse. He went to his father's study, where the family office records were kept in a filing system that had been organized by the same assistant for 11 years. He knew where the property files were. He had signed documents in this room. He knew the cabinets. He found the correspondence files for the townhouse's previous ownership company. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. A letter, maybe. Some indication of when Bellamy Urban Holdings had first made contact, some timeline he could map against what he knew about his marriage. He found something else instead. It was in a forwarded email chain that the previous property manager had sent to Edwin when the sale was being finalized. Standard documentation package. In the chain, buried several threads deep, was an email that the property manager had received from Warren's acquisitions team. The acquisitions team email referenced an initial inquiry. The initial inquiry referenced a source. Graham stared at the name. Then he went to his own email and searched for her address and pulled up every thread between them and worked backward through the months until he found it. An email from Clara to Warren, sent 8 months ago. Subject line, Fuse Property, Potential Acquisition Opportunity. He printed it. He drove to Clara's apartment. She answered the door in a sweater and reading glasses, which she sometimes wore in the evenings when her eyes were tired. She looked at his face and then at the paper in his hand, and she stepped back to let him in without asking what it was. He walked to her kitchen table and put the paper down. She looked at it. She didn't pick it up yet. She just looked at it the way you look at something you recognize. "How long have you been planning this?" Clara looked up at him. "Planning what?" "Buying the house out from under my family." She looked down at the paper. She looked at the date in the header, the timestamp on the email. She did the math the same way he had done it standing in his father's study, 8 months ago, before he and Camille had even been acknowledged, before Thanksgiving, before the hotel receipt she found, before her pregnancy, which she had confirmed at 11 weeks. 8 months ago, Clara had sent her brother a real estate recommendation for the building. The Calloways had been leasing for nearly 2 decades. Graham watched her face. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't constructing a defense. She was just looking at the date, and her expression was hard to read, and he needed to read it. "Was this before Camille?" Clara met his eyes. Yes. He heard it land. He heard what it meant and didn't mean. He heard all the questions it opened that he hadn't thought to ask yet. He stood in her kitchen, holding nothing, with a printed email on her table between them, and he understood that he had just walked into a version of this story that was more complicated than the one he thought he knew. The chapter of his certainty closed quietly. What came next, he didn't have words for yet. By that same Tuesday, the formal documentation from Warren's property team had been submitted to Calloway Hospitality's internal compliance office as part of a routine disclosure related to the acquisition. Calloway Hospitality had its own protocols. When a property connected to the company came under new ownership, and when that new ownership had potential relationship connections to personnel, compliance required review. The compliance officer was thorough. His name was David Park, and he had held the position for 6 years, and he was not the sort of person who let things sit because they were uncomfortable. He started pulling files. He was not, at this stage, looking at Camille specifically. He was doing a standard review of the property documentation, the acquisition chain, the disclosure timeline. He was looking at who knew what and when and whether any of it created liability for the company. What he found in the course of that review was a pattern. Expense reports, mostly. Meals charged to corporate accounts on evenings that didn't correspond to any logged client meetings. Hotel stays in the Hamptons billed under a hospitality account reserved for vendor entertainment. A car service used on a Sunday morning in September. Photography expenses that were listed under brand development but attached to no brand deliverable. He flagged them. Then he looked at who had approved them. Graham's name was on most of the approvals. David Park wrote up a preliminary memo and sent it to the general counsel's office, and then went home and ate dinner and did not think about it again that night, because that was the kind of person he was. The memo sat in the general counsel's inbox until Wednesday morning. Meanwhile, Camille was having lunch with the gossip columnist at a restaurant in the West Village. The story had done what she needed it to do in terms of initial noise, but it wasn't sticking the way she'd wanted. Clara hadn't responded publicly. Warren hadn't responded publicly. Graham's statement had muddied the narrative. She needed a second push. She was explaining this, in careful indirect language, over a glass of sparkling water, when her phone buzzed with an email notification from Calloway Hospitality's external server. She looked at it under the table. It was a compliance hold notice on her active account access, effective immediately. She set her phone face down on the table and smiled at the columnist and said, "Sorry, where were we?" and finished her lunch and did not let anything show on her face. But her mind was already moving, calculating, pulling up the internal map of what she had forwarded, what she had sent, what existed where. She was good at her work. She had always been good at her work. But there is a difference between being good at shaping information that belongs to you and being good at hiding information you took from someone else's server. Camille didn't fully understand that difference yet. She would. The city got colder that week. The kind of December cold that feels personal, that comes through every coat and makes you walk faster just to generate heat. Clara had her 6-month prenatal appointment on Thursday. Everything was fine. The baby was positioned well, moving often, already apparently committed to kicking at 10:30 in the evening specifically. The doctor showed Clara a measurement on the monitor and said the word growth. And Clara watched the small dark shape of her daughter's spine and thought about names. She was leaning toward Rose. She hadn't told anyone that yet. She took a cab home and made tea and sat at her kitchen table with her reading glasses on and a notepad in front of her. She had been reviewing some investment documents Warren had sent, a small commercial project in Brooklyn he was considering, nothing urgent, just something she had offered to look over because she was good at it and because it was good to be useful in a way that was entirely separate from being Graham's wife, or the Calloway's daughter-in-law, or the woman in the circulating gossip story. She was halfway through the second document when her phone rang. Graham. She looked at the screen for one ring, then she picked up. "I need to understand," he said. The email. The recommendation. "I need you to explain it to me." His voice was not angry. That was the thing. A week ago, she might have braced for anger, might have positioned herself for a version of this conversation that involved him defending his family's honor, or accusing her of planning some elaborate retaliation. But this was not that voice. This was the voice of a man who had spent 3 days sitting with a date on a printed email, and slowly realizing what it might mean. "Come over tomorrow," Clara said. Tomorrow, Graham. I'll explain everything." She hung up. She looked at the notepad. The Brooklyn property. Projected returns over 7 years. Clean numbers that did exactly what they were supposed to do. She picked up her pen and kept working. Outside, the city made its noise. Cabs and voices, and the distant sound of something being built a few blocks over, work that continued past dark because someone had a deadline. Clara worked too, in her quiet kitchen, while her daughter moved against her ribs, and the tea went slowly cold and the evening passed. She would tell Graham the truth tomorrow. All of it. She wasn't afraid of the truth. She had built her whole life on the understanding that the truth, told clearly and without performance, was the only thing that could actually hold any weight. What Graham did with it after that was going to be entirely up to him. Graham arrived at 9 in the morning. He knocked instead of ringing the bell, which Clara noticed. A small thing. But Graham had always been a bell ringer, confident, announcing himself. Knocking was different. Knocking was asking permission. She opened the door. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. His coat was good. It was always a good coat with Graham. But his eyes were tired, and he was holding himself with the careful posture of someone trying not to show how much effort that was taking. She let him in. The apartment was warmer than the Calloway townhouse had ever been. Not in temperature, just in feeling. Clara had arranged it the way she arranged everything, practically, with good light and things placed where they were actually useful. There were no statement pieces, no furniture chosen to impress guests, just a home that worked. Graham looked around briefly and didn't say anything about it. They sat at her kitchen table. She had made coffee. She put a cup in front of him, and he wrapped his hands around it without drinking. "Go ahead," he said. So she told him. She started 8 months back. She had been reviewing investment opportunities casually, the way she always had, left over from years of doing it professionally before she'd shifted focus after their wedding. A broker she knew from her acquisitions days had sent her a property memo. The ownership company behind the Calloway townhouse had been quietly exploring options, looking for buyers, not listing publicly but putting out feelers through back channels. Clara had looked at the numbers, the location, the long-term value relative to the current sale price. It was undervalued, meaningfully so. She had forwarded the opportunity to Warren with a short note, not a plan, not a strategy. Just, "This looks worth your attention." Warren had taken it from there. His team had negotiated for months. Clara had not been part of those negotiations. She had not tracked the timeline. She had sent one email and moved on. Graham was listening. His coffee sat untouched. "There's something else," Clara said. She looked at him directly. "When I sent Warren that recommendation, I told him that if he acquired the property, he should keep your family as tenants. As long as they remained financially reliable, there was no reason to disrupt the arrangement." Graham went very still. "I told him," Clara continued, "that your parents had been there for nearly 2 decades and that they deserved stability." She let that sit for a moment. "I wasn't building an exit," she said. "I was helping my brother make an investment." She held his gaze. "You turned it into my exit." Graham set his coffee cup down. He didn't say anything for a long time. Clara watched him process it, could almost see the sequence of it. The moment he had assumed this was calculated revenge, giving way to the much harder truth that it wasn't, that he had done this himself, that she had been, 8 months ago, still trying to protect the life they had together, still thinking about his family's comfort, still acting like someone invested in making the marriage work. And he had been sleeping with Camille. "You were protecting them," he said. His voice came out quieter than he'd probably intended. "I was protecting us," Clara said. "All of it, the whole thing, the family, the arrangement, the life we had." A pause. "I thought that was what you were doing too." Graham looked at the table. Graham. He looked up. "I wasn't building an exit. I was helping my brother make an investment." She kept her voice even. "You turned it into my exit." He absorbed it without deflecting. That was new. The Graham she had married would have found something to reframe here, some angle that softened his own role. This Graham just sat with it. "I love you," he said. It came out plainly, no strategy behind it. "I need you to know that." Clara looked at him. "I believe you." He straightened slightly. Some small hope moved across his face. "That's what makes this worse," she said. The hope went quiet. She leaned forward slightly. "Love that watches someone humiliate you and stays seated isn't the kind of love I want my daughter learning from." Graham's jaw tightened. Not in anger. In something closer to grief. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know, Clara. You kept calling it peace," she said. "Every time I raised something, every time I said I needed more from you with your mother, every time I said I felt alone at those dinners, you called it peace." She looked at him. "You kept calling it peace because you were never the one paying for it." He didn't argue. She continued. "A marriage isn't 2 people plus your mother's veto." Graham closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were wet. He did not try to talk her out of the divorce, did not make another promise about Camille or his family or who he intended to become. He just sat there with the truth of what she had said, and he let it be what it was. They stayed at that table for another hour, not fighting, just talking through what needed to happen. The baby, the legal process, what co-parenting was going to look like. Graham was attentive in a way that felt genuine rather than performed, asking questions, taking nothing for granted, not once suggesting that any of this was negotiable on her end. When he left, he shook Clara's hand at the door. She almost laughed. But she understood what he meant by it. Something formal, something that acknowledged they were moving into a different arrangement now, no longer husband and wife navigating a crisis. Two people who were going to raise a child together and needed to figure out how to do that with respect. She watched him go down the hallway toward the elevator. Then she closed the door and stood in her kitchen for a long time. The investigation moved faster than anyone at Calloway Hospitality had anticipated. David Park's memo had reached the general counsel by Wednesday morning. By Thursday, a small internal team had been assembled. They weren't looking for Camille specifically. They were following the expense irregularities, the approval chain, the documentation gaps. The documentation gaps led somewhere. IT pulled the server logs on Camille's corporate account access. The logs showed file transfers, several of them. Property documents, internal correspondence, acquisition chain materials, all forwarded from her corporate laptop to a personal email address over the course of one Sunday evening. The Sunday evening after Thanksgiving, one of the compliance team members cross-referenced the transfer timestamps against the publication date of the gossip column. The column had gone live Monday morning. The transfers had happened Sunday night. Then someone pulled the draft folder on her corporate messaging system. There was a draft, unsent through that channel, that referenced a contact name. The contact name matched the gossip columnist's professional alias. It wasn't a confession, but it was a trail that pointed in one direction and one direction only. Meanwhile, Calloway Hospitality's legal team was also reviewing the expense reports that David Park had originally flagged. Corporate cards used for private dinners, hotel stays, transportation, photography, all of it approved by Graham, most of it without corresponding business documentation. Warren's attorneys received a copy of the preliminary findings because several of the property documents Camille had forwarded were materials that had been shared with her under confidentiality obligations connected to the Bellamy Urban Holdings acquisition process. She had taken client documents and used them to manipulate a press narrative. That was not a gray area. Graham found out about the investigation on a Friday afternoon when the general counsel called him into a meeting and closed the door. He sat across from two attorneys and David Park and listened to what they had found. He did not interrupt. He did not try to explain Camille's behavior in ways that might reduce what it looked like. He sat there and he listened, and when they were done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said he needed to disclose something. He told them about the affair, about his personal relationship with Camille, and the length of it, and the ways in which that relationship had compromised his professional judgment when reviewing her expense submissions. He said he had approved charges he should have scrutinized. He said he had allowed his personal involvement to blur a professional line, and that the board deserved to know that from him before they heard it from anyone else. The general counsel looked at him for a long time. Graham looked back. "You could have let us find this on our own," the general counsel said. "Yes," Graham said, "I could have." He went home that evening and called his father. Edwin picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "I heard you disclose to the board," Edwin said. His voice was flat in a way that meant he was controlling it carefully. "I did." "Graham." A pause. "You could have contained this." Graham sat with that for a moment. Contained it. He thought about all the things his family had contained over the years. All the things absorbed and redirected and smoothed over. All the damage that had been quietly managed so that the surface of the Calloway name stayed clean. He thought about Clara sitting alone at that Thanksgiving table. "That's what this family calls everything," Graham said. Edwin didn't answer. "Contain it. Hide it. Make somebody else absorb the damage." Graham's voice was steady. "I'm done with that." The line was quiet. "This will cost you," Edwin said finally. "Professionally, the bonus. Possibly the role, depending on how the board moves."
I know, and you did it anyway.
"Yes." Edwin hung up. Graham set his phone on the counter and looked out his apartment window. He had moved out of the townhouse 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. His own place, his own lease, nothing connected to his parents' accounts. It was smaller than anything he'd lived in since his 20s. He liked it. Camille received official notice of contract termination on a Monday. The letter cited breach of confidentiality obligations, misuse of corporate resources, and conduct incompatible with the terms of her consulting agreement. It was precise and complete and gave her very little to argue with because the evidence behind each point was documented and timestamped. She went to her attorney the same afternoon. Her attorney looked at the evidence summary and told her plainly that her options were limited. Fighting the termination publicly would require surfacing the same evidence that implicated her. A countersuit would invite discovery that would only expose more. Camille sat across from her attorney in a very expensive office and understood for the first time that the plan had failed, not because of Clara's money or Warren's leverage or Graham's disclosure. It had failed because she had made specific choices that left specific records, and records Unlike reputations don't respond to spin. She made one last move. She contacted Calloway Hospitality's general counsel through her attorney. She said, documentation of her own. Private emails that demonstrated Dorothy Calloway had been aware of the affair months before Thanksgiving. Emails in which Dorothy had expressed a preference for Camille over Clara, had characterized Clara as unsuitable, had actively encouraged the relationship developing between Camille and Graham. She would keep those emails private, Camille said, in exchange for three things. The company would waive its claims against her. She would keep her outstanding consulting fees, and Calloway Hospitality would issue a statement minimizing her professional misconduct. The message reached Dorothy within the hour. Dorothy called the general counsel immediately and told him to negotiate. Clara found out through her own attorney, who had been looped in because the property documents were still part of the picture. She called Warren. Dorothy wants to negotiate with her, Clara said. I heard. I'm not doing that. Warren was quiet on his end for a moment. It's not entirely your call. The company. Her voice was firm. I am not participating in another cover-up. Not for Dorothy. Not for the Calloway name. Not for any of it. A pause. Okay, he said. Okay, Clara. She took a breath. The emails come out, or they don't. But I'm not buying her silence. That's not how this ends. She thought about something she'd understood sitting at her kitchen table the morning after she'd read the gossip column. Truth isn't blackmail just because you're afraid of it. Suppressing something real because it's inconvenient is still suppression. She had spent 11 years in a marriage that ran on careful suppressions, and she was finished with that mechanism entirely. Set up the meeting, she told her attorney later that day. All parties. Let's finish this. The law office was on the 32nd floor of a building in Midtown. Conference Room B. A long table, good chairs, a view of the city that nobody looked at. Clara arrived with her attorney, Warren arrived with his. Graham was already there when they walked in, sitting near the middle of the table with Calloway Hospitality's general counsel beside him. Edwin sat at the far end. Dorothy beside him, her posture perfect, and her expression composed in the manner of someone who had decided that composure was the only card she had left. Camille came in last, with her attorney, 5 minutes after the scheduled start time. She was dressed carefully, professional. She sat down and placed her hands flat on the table and looked at the room with the evaluating focus of someone running numbers on their position. She believed Clara could see it, that she still had leverage. Clara's attorney opened the meeting with a summary of the documented evidence against Camille, the file transfers, the timestamps, the expense irregularities, the consulting fees connected to misconduct. He was brief and precise and did not editorialize. Camille's attorney responded with the expected counter. His client had been unfairly targeted. The evidence was circumstantial in places. The termination had been handled without appropriate process. Then Camille spoke directly. She looked down the table toward Clara and Warren and laid out her terms. Waive the claims, release the fees, issue the statement. In exchange, Dorothy's email stayed private. The room waited. Dorothy shifted in her chair. Clara looked at Camille. Truth isn't blackmail just because you're afraid of it. Camille's expression didn't change. I'm protecting myself. I know, Clara said. That's all you've been doing this whole time. She kept her voice level. It's also what destroyed you. Camille turned to face her fully. You want to ruin me? No, Clara said. A beat. I want you to live with what you actually did. The room was quiet. Camille looked at her attorney. Her attorney looked at the evidence summary on the table in front of him. He said something quietly to Camille that no one else could hear. Camille sat back. The negotiation that followed was not dramatic. It was just legal. Calloway Hospitality terminated the contract for cause, which was documented and defensible. Under the civil settlement, Camille would repay the improperly charged expenses and surrender the outstanding consulting fees connected to the misconduct. Warren's attorneys filed a separate notice regarding the confidential property documents she had taken without authorization. She was not arrested. There was no courtroom, no public spectacle. But by the end of the meeting, two things were true. Her professional relationship with Calloway Hospitality was permanently severed, and the documentation of what she had done would follow her into any future professional situation where due diligence was conducted. Two of her major clients left her agency within the following 2 weeks. They had been informed that she had used confidential client information for personal leverage. In communications work, that is the kind of information that travels fast. Her business survived, on a much smaller scale, with different clients, without the access and credibility she had spent 15 years building. Camille left the conference room without speaking to Clara again. She walked to the elevator. The doors closed. That was the last time Clara ever saw her. The Calloway Hospitality Board met the following Thursday. They did not discipline Graham for infidelity. That was not the board's jurisdiction. What they addressed was the professional failure, the undisclosed personal relationship with a consultant, the expense approvals made without appropriate scrutiny, the compromise of professional judgment in a context where his role required objectivity. Graham accepted a temporary step back from his executive responsibilities and forfeited his annual performance bonus. The board noted his voluntary disclosure in the record, which meant something procedurally, even if it didn't change the immediate consequences. Edwin drove to Graham's apartment that evening. He did not call ahead. Graham opened the door and looked at his father and stepped aside to let him in. Edwin walked to the center of the living room. He looked around at the apartment, smaller than anything his son had lived in for a decade, and then he turned. "You could have contained this," Edwin said. Graham looked at his father, at the silver hair and the straight shoulders and that absolute certainty in his posture that had been there every single day of Graham's life. The certainty that problems were things you managed, not things you answered for. "That's what this family calls everything," Graham said. Edwin frowned. "Graham, contain it, hide it. Make somebody else absorb the damage." Graham's voice stayed even. "That's the system, Dad. Someone always absorbs the damage. It just usually wasn't us." Edwin opened his mouth. Graham shook his head. "I'm not doing it anymore." His father stood there. Edwin Calloway, who had built a hospitality company from a single boutique hotel, who had raised 2 sons in a townhouse he had never actually owned, who had spent 30 years treating containment as wisdom. He had no language for the version of his son standing in front of him now. "She's leaving you anyway," Edwin said finally. "After all this, Clara's still leaving." Graham nodded. "Yes," Edwin spread his hands. "Then what exactly did any of this cost you?" Graham thought about that for a moment. "Everything I deserve to lose," he said. Edwin left. Graham sat down on his couch. He thought about something Clara had said at the kitchen table, about paying for peace, about who absorbs the cost of a family's careful surface. He had grown up in a house that ran on that system, and he had never once until now counted what it cost other people. It was a hard thing to see once you finally saw it. He called Dorothy the next morning. She answered with the careful voice she used when she was deciding how a conversation was going to go before it started. "I want to be clear about something," Graham said. "Graham, I think we should wait until things settle before." "You're my mother," he said. "But you don't get a vote in my marriage, my child, or Clara's life anymore." Dorothy was quiet. "I mean that completely. Not as a temporary boundary. Not as something that gets renegotiated in 6 months. She's leaving you," Dorothy said. Her voice had gone sharp. "She was always going to leave you. Everything she did." "Stop," Dorothy stopped. "Clara didn't do anything except survive a dinner that you arranged to humiliate her." His voice was steady. "And then she left with her dignity completely intact, which is more than I can say for anyone else who was at that table." A long silence. "She's leaving you anyway," Dorothy said again. Her voice was quieter now, bitter in a way that wanted him to feel it. Graham did not defend himself. "Yes," he said. "Then, and that's the consequence of what I did." He hung up. The rocking chair appeared on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the meeting in the conference room. Clara opened the door, and Graham was standing in the hallway with it. A wooden rocking chair they had bought together 3 months into her pregnancy, before Thanksgiving, before everything fell apart. One of the legs had cracked during the move out of the townhouse. Clara had noticed it missing from the pile of her things that Graham's movers had brought over, and had assumed it was gone. Graham had repaired it himself. She could see the work he'd done, the careful joining, the wood stain matched close enough that you had to look for the repair to find it. No flowers, no box from a jewelry store, no card with a speech inside it. Just a chair he had fixed, carried up 3 flights because the elevator was slow, and was now holding in a hallway with his coat still on. She stepped back and let him bring it inside. They set it by the window in the nursery. The light came through at an angle in the late afternoon and landed on the wood and made the repair almost invisible. Clara sat down in it. It was steady. The leg held. She got up, and they went to the kitchen and sat, a few feet of table between them, and Graham looked at his hands. "I've been trying to figure out what I could do to make you trust me again," he said. Clara considered that for a moment. "That's still the wrong question." He looked up. She continued. "You should become someone trustworthy even if I never come back." Graham was quiet. He sat with that the way he'd learned over the past several weeks to sit with things instead of immediately responding. It was a new practice for him. Clara could see the effort in it. "You're right," he said. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the city moved. A siren a few blocks over. A car horn. The ordinary noise of an ordinary Wednesday. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" Clara looked at him. "No." No pause, no softening. Just the clear, simple truth of it. Graham's eyes dropped. "I can let go of my anger without forgiving the choices that destroyed our marriage," she said. "Those are different things." He was quiet. I hope you become a better man, she continued. I mean that, genuinely, but you won't become that man for me. He looked at her for a long moment. So there's really no chance for us? Clara shook her head. I don't want our marriage back. He nodded, once, slowly. He did not bargain. He did not say he would wait. He did not make the grief about what he needed from her. He just sat there and accepted what she had said with the full weight of it and did not try to put it down. Then he said, then I'll learn how to be a good father without asking you to be my wife. Clara looked at him. That's what our daughter needs. They sat with that for a moment. Both of them. The truth of what they were going to be to each other now, not what they had been, not what either of them had imagined standing in a church 6 years ago, but what was actually possible and real and worth building. Then the baby kicked. Hard enough that Clara's breath caught slightly. She put her hand on her stomach automatically. Graham looked toward her, instinct pulling his attention there, and then he stopped himself. He did not reach out. He stayed where he was on his side of the table. He waited. Clara watched him wait. Then she reached across the table and took his hand and placed it over the place where their daughter was moving. Graham went completely still. Clara watched his face change. All the grief and regret and exhaustion that had been sitting there for weeks moved aside for a moment, and something else came through. Something that had nothing to do with the marriage or the affair or Thanksgiving or any of it. Just his daughter, moving under his hand. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him. They were both crying quietly, neither of them trying to hide it or explain it. After a while, Graham lifted his hand. He stood up. He put his coat on and picked up his keys from the table where he'd set them, and he walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the doorframe. He didn't turn around. Thank you, he said quietly. Then he left. Clara stayed at the table. She could hear the elevator down the hall, the doors opening and then closing. She sat there until the building was quiet again. Then she got up and walked to the nursery and sat in the rocking chair by the window. The afternoon light was going. The city outside was moving into evening. She rocked slowly and put both hands on her stomach and thought about the name Rose. It was the right name. She was sure of it now. Clara cooked this year, nothing elaborate. Roasted chicken, because she had decided she didn't actually like turkey that much, and there was no one at this table she needed to perform for. Sweet potatoes, green beans, a pie she had ordered from the bakery 2 blocks over because she was practical about her limitations in pastry. Her apartment smelled like rosemary and butter and something warm. Warren sat on the couch with Rose asleep against his chest. Rose Bellamy Calloway, 7 months old, with Clara's eyes and a look of absolute authority when she was awake that made Warren say, every time he held her, that this child was going to run something someday. Clara moved between the kitchen and the table, setting things out slowly, no rush. The table was small. 3 settings because Graham was coming later to pick up Rose for his own part of the holiday. There was no strategic seating arrangement. No one at this table needed a position. The doorbell rang at 6. Clara carried Rose to the door and opened it. Graham stood on the other side. He was wearing a coat she hadn't seen before, and he looked genuinely like a man who had been sleeping better. He had a bag over one shoulder, the diaper bag she had packed, and he held his arms out for Rose with the practiced ease of someone who had done this enough times now that it was becoming natural. Clara transferred the baby carefully. Graham held his daughter with both hands and looked at her face the way he always did, like he was making sure she was still real. Then he looked at Clara. You happy? Clara considered the question. She looked back at her small table and the roasted chicken and Warren on the couch and the rocking chair visible in the nursery doorway and the life she had built in the last 12 months out of the rubble of one that didn't work. I'm peaceful, she said. Graham gave her a small, quiet smile. Sad around the edges, genuine in the middle. You deserve that. Clara looked at him. At this man she had loved and would not go back to and did not hate. So do you? She said. He left with Rose walking down the hallway toward the elevator, adjusting the bag on his shoulder, already looking back down at his daughter's face. Clara closed the door. Warren looked up from the couch. You okay? Clara stood for a moment. She looked at the table, at the chair by the window, at the city outside doing its ordinary, beautiful, relentless thing. Yeah, she said. She walked back to the kitchen. She checked the potatoes. She picked up her glass. I used to think being loved meant being chosen, she said. Warren tilted his head. And now? Clara smiled. Now I think it means being respected after the choice is made. She carried the food to the table. Warren got up and came to sit across from her. They said nothing else for a moment. Just 2 people at a small table with good food and no performance required. Clara picked up her fork. Outside, the city moved through its evening. Somewhere in it, Graham was walking to his car with their daughter. Somewhere in it, the Calloway townhouse sat under new management with a lease winding down. Somewhere in it, the story that Camille had tried to write about Clara was already being replaced by the next story and the next one after that, the way all stories eventually are. And here in this apartment, in this life she had chosen for herself, Clara ate her dinner, peaceful, fully, at her own table. This story is a work of fiction created for storytelling and entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, events, or situations is purely coincidental.